All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're breaking down a pretty explosive allegation from a columnist, a claim that a highly sophisticated scheme was used to essentially hijack the entire Philippine national budget. We're going to follow the source material, step by step, to really understand how this was allegedly pulled off.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We'll start with the absolutely massive P56 billion figure at the heart of all this. Then we'll look at the crisis that supposedly set the stage for everything. After that, we'll break down the so-called clever mechanics of the scheme itself, look at the very real price of the plan, and wrap it all up with the whistleblower who allegedly blew the whole thing wide open.
So first things first, let's get to this central claim, the number that really kicks off this entire story.
At the very heart of this story is just a staggering number, 56 billion pesos. Now, the columnist, Rigoberto Tiglao, alleges this wasn't just some run-of-the-mill corruption. This was supposedly the target amount for kickbacks in a massive scheme that he claims went all the way to the very top of the government.
You know, the columnist is very specific with his language here. He doesn't just call it corruption. The key word he uses is hijacking, a claim that this was a fundamental takeover of the entire budget process. He designed it, in his own words, to be 100 times worse than scandals we've seen before.
So, how did we even get here? Well, the columnist points to a very specific sequence of events that he believes created the perfect storm for this alleged scheme to take root. According to the source, the context here is absolutely critical. It allegedly starts with the president boasting about thousands of new flood control projects. But then, just a few months later, a string of typhoons hits, causing massive, devastating floods and sparking a ton of public anger. The columnist argues this crisis created the perfect cover and really the motivation for the budget scheme.
Now, the article claims this method was so unusual, so different, that it actually confused even seasoned budget experts. So let's take a look at what the columnist says made this scheme a so-called clever innovation.
And this brings up a really good question, one that a lot of commentators were asking. If the president has so much influence over the budget, why not just add the funds to the initial proposal, the National Expenditure Program, or NEP? Why was this supposedly complicated method even necessary?
And here's the columnist's theory. He argues that the initial budget is already like a tightly packed jigsaw puzzle. Every piece, every project is already allocated. Trying to just force billions more in at that stage would set off all sorts of alarms and kick off huge political fights. This alleged scheme, he argues, was designed to quietly sneak around that whole process.
Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts. This is the real core of the columnist's argument. How exactly did this alleged scheme actually work?
Right, so the crucial thing to get here is the timing. It's all about when this allegedly happened. These aren't just any budget additions. The term insertions refers to a very specific act, slipping these new projects in at the absolute last minute of the legislative process, right when the House and Senate are supposed to be finalizing the bill.
This chart really lays it out. On the left, you've got your standard by-the-book budget process. But on the right, that's the process the columnist describes. A private list of projects is supposedly created, it's inserted at the very end, and then, and this is the really critical part, the president is said to have vetoed other items in his own budget to make space for them.
So to recap, the source breaks it down into a three-step play. First, a private list of projects gets created. Second, that list gets inserted late in the game. And third, the presidential veto is used not to cut spending, but to cleverly shift funds over to these new projects, all while keeping the total budget number looking perfectly legal.
But here's the thing, right? Making 100 billion pesos in new projects just appear out of thin air wasn't free. The article claims this came at a very direct and very high cost to other government programs, especially social services.
According to the columnist, this is the total price tag. A whopping 168 billion pesos vetoed from the administration's own proposed budget. This was all allegedly done just to clear enough room for that roughly 100 billion pesos in new inserted projects.
And this table, drawn right from the source, shows us exactly where that money was allegedly pulled from. I mean, look at these numbers. We're talking 77 billion supposedly cut from health and social programs, 50 billion pesos from the country's main cash assistance program for the poor. The columnist argues this was the direct trade-off needed to fund those new projects.
So, the whole scheme, according to the columnists, might have just stayed hidden forever, if not for one of the alleged participants deciding to turn whistleblower and bring the details out into the open.
And the claims this whistleblower supposedly brought forward were, well,
they were explosive. First, the release of 2 separate lists detailing all these inserted projects. Second, the direct accusation that these projects were a funnel for 56 billion pesos in kickbacks to the nation's top 2 leaders. And finally, the most direct claim of all, that the president was personally involved, allegedly filling in blank items in the budget himself.
And the source article leaves us right here with this really provocative final thought. The allegation isn't just that money was stolen. It's that the fundamental process of how a government funds itself was compromised. It really raises a critical question, you know? What happens when the very system of checks and balances becomes the alleged scene of the crime?